Welcome to the 5K5. I am Mark, and I'm joined today by the one and the only Jonathan. And then we also have Gary joining us today. Jonathan is our director of AI integration, and Gary is a senior developer, and he has been in the industry for more than more than 16 years, right, Gary?
Yes.
That's awesome. So today we're going to be talking about coding and how it's changed over the years from traditional coding to AI, how AI is, integrating itself into the coding processes and workflows and things like that because it's changing everything and it's changing every day. Tomorrow something new might come out that none of us have even heard of, and it's kind of cool. So before we get into it, Jonathan, do you have anything about it that you would like to say to kind of intro the aspect of AI and coding?
Just to kind of frame it, I think this is a conversation that's super relevant to pretty much any job title in a modern company. If you're making more than a million a year as a company, which is anyone we're working with, everywhere from the CEO top level down to, of course, developers, of course, but production, engineering, accounting, AI, and coding. Honestly, is relevant to everyone now. We're going to be focusing on like developers specifically. So if you're a developer, of course, this is for you. But don't think, oh, I'm not a developer. This isn't relevant to me. Like it still does tangentially lead back to everyone in an organization.
Yeah, for sure. So we're gonna ask Gary the first question, and then Jonathan, you can kind of piggyback. How has your development workflow changed the most over the last decade from traditional coding to now using AI tools?
So I think the biggest change that happened over the last decade would be speed and efficiency. Before we used to do things manually. We used to write code manually. We used to look for documentations manually and then search for forums. Right now, with AI assisted coding, it helps us reduce those repetitive tasks and speed up the process much more than what we had before. So I think that's the biggest change that happened over the last decade.
Yeah. What is your favorite thing about coding in general?
I like to solve things. I mean, to think outside the box, to debug. I mean, there's a sense of satisfaction whenever you do something. I mean, whenever you're debugging, you spend hours and hours for those, and then you finally get it. I mean, there's a sense of satisfaction in you, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, the way my workflow and workflows I've seen other people that are in the development space have changed over the last, I mean, decade for sure, over the last really 3 years as AI has become more prevalent with development work, is seeing external sources, which, like Gary said, used to be forums or websites like that. Seeing those used to be like, okay, let me plan everything myself. And then when I run into an issue or I have a specific question, I'm going to do that research for it. Now it's more like AI is a part of even like the early decision making and planning process. And there's more time spent on like, how do I make sure that any AI technology that's being used for this development project is given all the context that it needs to be able to do the assisting work that it does along with us. We use the term context engineering a lot around here. It's we kind of joke about it a little bit, but it's also a really huge thing. Andre Karpathy, I think, coined that term relatively recently, but it's all about how do you give AI the biggest possible context. So while we're still very much like the developers are at the helm of all the projects we're doing, we're not just like shipping it off to AI and say, do it for us and then pretty publishing whatever it outputs. Not at all. Very much so. It's more of like how do we give it all the context it needs to make decisions along with us that we can make decisions that are in line with the project's goal, and AI can help us speed up our own development process along the way.
yeah, yeah. That's huge. What is one thing that AI has made significantly easier for developers, and one thing that has made it more challenging?
I think for me, I'll go first. So one thing that's made it easier by far, it sounds silly, but it's pulling in documentation from different libraries or API sources or things that you need to either use for your development process or for the finished product. So for example, if you're building an integration tool from the scratch that needs to integrate with um, Salesforce, for example, or HubSpot, HubSpot's API documentation or Salesforce's API documentation that can be pulled into, again, AI's context so that as you're doing development work and having AI assist with certain specific parts of that process, it saves the time from having to, as a human, read through literally every single like endpoint documentation in like the API docs. You can lean into AI a lot for that overall perspective. And then you as a human can jump into the specific parts of that process that you need to and narrow in and like tweak exactly what you need to tweak.
Yeah,
So for me, I think that would be writing code. So with AI assisted code, it eliminates the need for doing repetitive tasks like writing codes and thousands of codes. With the AI assisted, it generates the codes and then it gives you a list of things to review. The challenge is that you should make sure that everything that is generated is that you need to review those things instead of just accepting those things. So an understanding with how the code works is really essential into this one.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a huge thing that, people miss when they try to, use AI to help them code is they'll do the vibe coding thing where, they'll code, they'll do vibe coding, and then what they'll do is they'll just do it, let it do its thing for them, and they won't check it, and they'll expect to get results when that's not how it works. You know what I mean? You have to have that understanding of code in its structure of it to really understand and grasp the entire concept so that you can then, when you make edits to it, you can review it, it goes smoothly, and you kind of know what you're doing that way. So, what skills do developers need now that were less important before, and which old school skills are still essential?
So for me, I would say that the ability to read, analyze the code, the ability to understand how the code works, what's happening under the hood. It's not necessarily less important before, but I think up to this point, it's still essentials to have those things. And also, I think it's still needed up to this date that you have the basic fundamentals of everything. So those things are really necessary if you want to create a great app that you need or a great app that you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. I'll answer the question can be maybe in reverse. So like which old school skills are still essential? I don't think it's important anymore to have every single coding language that you're developing in memorized from memory where you can just like type, nonstop without looking at any documentation. That is not as essential anymore. But I do think it is just as essential to understand the fundamentals of programming. So
Yeah.
there's stories you hear all the time of, people on YouTube or X or wherever, like, oh yeah, I just vibe coded this thing overnight or over the weekend. And that's cool. Power to them. More power to them. But what we do here is we work with large corporations where major errors or security vulnerabilities or things like that just cannot happen. So that's not something we do here, obviously. But we still need to like all of our developers have to have and have to continue having a strong grasp on the fundamentals of how programming works essentially. What I think developers need to have more of a skill on now that wasn't as much necessary as before is I would say the engineering side of software engineering, which sounds silly to say engineering for like a small little web app you're creating. But again, what we're working with is large, like enterprise level, corporate level solutions. And for that, now because you don't have to write all of the code yourself and you can lean into AI for some of that heavy lifting, like Gary said, you now get to be at a higher level and now have to be at a higher level where you can no
Yeah.
longer be like, oh, well, I wrote this code. Let me pass it off to my manager or off to the client and just see if it works and let them deal with the repercussions. Like, no, you have to see the whole picture of what is the business problem that this software piece is solving and is it actually doing that versus before you kind of get away with a little more because you could pass it off to like a senior developer or forget about it and get it to a client and the client complains about it like you can't do that anymore.
I see it now where the story of developers now where, they'll use AI to help them code and it takes them, way quicker, but the debugging process is still so long. The last 10% takes 90% of the time. And that's so true with AI and coding is, even before you would manually code before AI and stuff, and you still had to, take a crazy amount of time to debug. That's so that doesn't change. Actually, you probably have to debug a little bit more, with AI coding.
Yeah, we definitely have some ways we get around that with like context engineering,
Mhm.
going back to that term as well. Like if you give it the right kind of context, AI is going to make less mistakes. But yeah, you're right. There's still any whether it's human or AI generated code, like you just still have to do some debugging afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. Any closing remarks, guys?
I would just say I think if you're a current developer in the space and you're like, what do I do with AI? We can certainly support you in that role. We
Mhm.
we consult with companies in that situation. Also, if you're someone that is looking into getting into development work and wondering, should I still learn development with what AI is doing? We don't have any consulting programs for that specifically, but my advice there would be like, absolutely go for it, but don't go into a career thinking you're just going to be a menial software developer.
Yeah,
Expect to have to be like senior level very soon and understand how to incorporate AI into your workflow.
yeah,
But I think there's a huge new realm of possibilities, even to new developers in the industry, if you take the right track there.
yeah. I agree.
I think it's really important to understand the code and just not accept everything.
Yeah,
It's It's basically you need to review everything that AI has generated, because the thing is you could be exposing sensitive data. You could be exposing your API keys. You could be
Yeah.
exposing other password sensitive like that. So it's really important to make sure that everything is being reviewed before you accept it.
Yeah, that is huge, Gary. Especially the API keys, because we're using
Yeah.
so many API keys. People can so easily just paste the API key into the code
Mm.
base and have it stored there, and it's like, no, that's so dangerous, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
But awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining the 5K5 today,
Yep.
and listeners, thank you for listening, and tune in for the next one. Peace out.